Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nicholas Corcel, and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we're going to be continuing our read-along of Mao II by Don DeLillo and really focus in on chapter 1 of the story. And so chapter 1 comes immediately after the prologue, which is called At Yankee Stadium, where we meet Karen Janey, we meet the cult, and they have this massive mass wedding where all of these girls from America are marrying these Korean men that they don't know. And we get a little bit of insight on this cult. We hear a little bit about Master Moon and things like that. But we leave that scene before anything is really resolved. And I mean, that's very common of a literary fiction writer. They give you some tidbits to really chew on and think about, and then we move on to the next scene. And that's no different here with Don DeLillo. So chapter 1 of part 1 starts out really interestingly. And so I'm going to read this first sentence to you because I think it's really illustrative of what DeLillo does throughout this novel, where he gives you these one or two sentence just absolute gems, and he can condense the whole modern world into one simple sentence. And so we have, he walked among the bookstore shelves, hearing muzak in the air. And muzak is really interesting, and I think a book is always good when it makes you start Googling things on the first page, right? And not in a way where it's overly intellectual, but where they use a word that you've never encountered before, and it's so specific, and that when you research it and you look it up, you're not put off by the pretentiousness of the author, but rather you're amazed by the precision. And Muzak is no different. So it's a type of, it's an American brand of retail background music. And if you see me looking down at all, I've just been taking some notes in this journal about what I'm reading, because I'm really trying to get more intentional with what I read and how I consume it. And so I think that was super interesting that he takes us right into that time period that he's writing about by talking about this brand of music that is incredibly relevant to it. And then just a few sentences later, we get a little more information about this man. Reading directly from the book, he was a young man, shrewd in his fervors, who knew there were books he wanted to read and others he absolutely had to own. The ones that gesture in special ways, that have a rareness or daring, a charge of heat that stains the air around them. And so, I don't know, to me, that's super interesting. I think every reader has gone through that phase, or perhaps permanently lives in that phase, where we have this dichotomy of books. You know, there's the books that we love and the books that we want to actually read, and there's the books that you want to be seen with, you know. The books, I don't know, the best example I can think of is maybe Infinite Jest, and I'm not knocking Infinite Jest. A lot of people love it. I've tried to read it. I failed it. But that book to me encapsulates this point perfectly, because I bought that book because I wanted to be a guy who has Infinite Jest on his bookshelf. And I don't know, and it's led me to take it off my bookshelf until I read it. I feel like, I almost want to earn the right to have it on my bookshelf and not just be that pretentious lit bro who just, has Infinite Jest and Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses and all these books that he's never going to read, or has never even really made an honest effort out of. I don't know. I think that DeLillo encapsulates that really well. And this guy, this unnamed narrator, at this point we have no idea who he is. We're really digging into who he is as a person. The fact that he is, he's self-aware of it, but he's not pushing back against it. He's not outright pushing back against it. So he's a guy who is tuned into the literary world. He understands that dichotomy between the different types of books that you can have. So he's aware, but he's not resistant. And, in many ways, not being resistant to something is similar to embracing it. And so we're thinking, okay, maybe this main character is embracing some of the negative stereotypes of being like a lit bro, things like that. And so that's the first idea that we're encountering when we're reading chapter 1. As we continue, we get some more musings about what he's thinking about this bookstore. He flippantly thinks about how these bookstores make him feel sick at times, and then he moves to the modern classics and hones in on these two books. And these books are both written by Bill Gray. And these books are described as very lean, and then this unnamed man says he likes to check the bookstores and the bookshelves for Bill. So this man who we know might have some pretentious inclinations, at least literary speaking, he knows Bill Gray, and Bill Gray is, we can only assume, is a modern genius, because he's written a modern classic, and if he still knows him, he's still alive. So we have to assume that Bill Gray is a is a truly great contemporary writer in the context of this book. This scene is immediately interrupted by what we can only assume to be a crazy homeless man. He bursts into the bookstore. We're in New York City, and he's just yelling that he wants to sign his books. I need to sign my books. I need to sign my books. This type of scene, and it's dismissed quickly, in what is just described as, a typical New York moment. But it's interesting, as soon as we're introduced to Bill, it's immediately foiled by this crazy homeless person. So are some of these characteristics that we associate with homeless people, this eccentricity, almost free thinking maybe in some aspects, depending on how you would really want to think about it. Should we be associating some of these with Bill? I don't know. These are kind of the things that we're thinking of. So we're characterizing Bill without meeting Bill. We're characterizing Bill through a series of proxies, right? So these proxies being this unnamed narrator, this homeless man, and this scene. We know why is this guy in New York without Bill? Why is Bill not in New York? New York is the writer's mecca of the world. So why is Bill not there? And also right around this time, this unnamed narrator, we realize his name, and his name is Scott Martineau. After leaving the bookstore, Scott decides, he's in New York City, why not make the most of it? And he wants to go look at a Warhol exhibition. And in this Warhol exhibition, we're introduced again to this idea of crowds, that we learned early on, where we talked about at the end of the prologue, where it says, the future belongs to crowds, the world is crowds, things like this. This idea of, we're up on this top perch looking down at this mass wedding at Yankee Stadium, and we're seeing like this collectivism, this hive mind state where all of these people are acting together as one, and maybe the craziness of what they're doing becomes non-existent because they're part of the collective. So if I'm one of 100,000 people doing something, even if that thing that we're all doing is bad or objectively wrong, it doesn't feel wrong because we're in the majority. And I think that's a super interesting idea. It's especially relevant today. You see, once a couple people make a point loud enough, people will join in, and then they want to be part of that group. We hear all the time, especially like talking about maybe ancient history with like Nazi Germany. We always hear people say, oh, I wouldn't be a Nazi. I wouldn't be a Nazi. But what is interesting is, if enough people who have some sort of social cachet, if enough people who, I don't know, maybe are popular on a campus or are attractive, or there's something about them that is alluring, if enough of them started to push like Nazi ideology, for example, would the masses just fall in line? Would the masses start justifying it? Would anti-Semitism rise wildly? I think the answer is obviously yes. I think that we've seen countless examples throughout history, and in many ways I think we're seeing an example of it right now. Regardless, Scott continues through the museum, and he stumbles upon this exhibit about Chairman Mao. And so there's all these pictures of Chairman Mao, the leader of communist China, the implementer of one-child policy, and a bunch of other controversial policies. And he just is looking at these images of Mao and thinking about them, and thinking about the role that people like Mao, men like Mao, have in society. And so this is the first introduction of the idea of who creates the culture of the world. Is it the writer, is it the artist, or is it these very powerful men and organizations? It's the first time that we get to chew on that, or I guess the second time, because we talked about the cult in the beginning with like Master Moon. And so we have this idea of, okay, who are the creators of culture? We have Master Moon, we have Bill Gray, the novelist, or we have Chairman Mao. And all three of these people are controlling the culture and controlling the narratives and controlling the crowds in many ways of the era, and they're defining the era. And so as time goes on, when you look at the modern world, who has shaped the modern world more than Chairman Mao? It's something to think about, because a country that big, a country that powerful, the meteoric rise that he led them through, his policies, right or wrong, it's hard to deny, that these people have shaped the world in a way that Shakespeare, Aristotle, Plato, Hemingway, all these people have in the past. And so we have this notion of who is the one that's controlling the narrative, and I don't know, I think it's interesting. And I think a lot of the points that DeLillo makes throughout the book, and it becomes more prominent as we progress, is the writer's position in society waning? Is the writer becoming less important? And by the writer, I mean, the writer of literary fiction, the writer of the cultural narrative, the writer who's got his finger right on the pulse of of what his country, his people, or even the world is feeling at the time. Either way, back to the story, Scott leaves the museum and he runs into another crazy person. This time it's a woman. And she runs up to him and says that he's safe because he's from out of town. And she can trust him because he's from out of town. And then she tries to hand him a bundle. And this bundle, Scott never gets a full look at it, but the bundle is what he believes, at least, is a baby. He thinks that the bundle is a baby. And while this woman is trying to give him what we assume to be the baby, she describes Scott as her guide from the frontier. And it's interesting because we have the introduction of Mao Zedong as a character, and then immediately we have a baby being given away. And of course, Mao is incredibly famous for the one-child China policy. And we're not going to get into that too far today. But it's interesting because we see that just immediate foil, and DeLillo is great at just idea, foil immediately. You know, that's how it seems like he likes to present his arguments and present the points that he's trying to make. You know, he'll give you something and then he'll give you the opposite immediately, and then, you know, then he'll move on to the next idea and you're left to kind of marinate and think on it. And I think that's why I haven't finished the book even for the first time yet, but I can already tell that Mao II and maybe all of DeLillo's work, I haven't read anything else in his oeuvre, but I think that these are books that would really, really be great to reread time and time again, because I think you're going to get more layers of the argument each reread. But Scott pushes past the woman. He doesn't take the baby, or he doesn't even really figure out what it is, and he meets this photographer named Britta, who, that's why he's in the city. He's in the city to meet her, and there's one of the greatest lines I've ever encountered in a book, and I'll read it to you real quick. It doesn't really have anything to do with the plot, but when you're reading a master like DeLillo, you have to sometimes just stop and just be like, wow, this is incredible. I could, you know, sit down at a desk for 10 years and I'd never come up with a line half as good as this. So they are walking through New York, Scott and Britta, talking about like how New York has fallen, things like that. Just normal conversation. And then we get this line. So let's listen. So the signs for Mita, Midori, Kirin, Magno, Suntory, words that were part of some synthetic mass language, the Esperanto of jet lag. And so they're talking about this hotel and this restaurant they're at, but that's not the important part. The important part is this little clause, the Esperanto of jet lag. And I don't know, that to me is just beautiful. It's magnificent, right? Like the Esperanto, of course, being this the attempt to make a universal global language, which of course failed massively because, you know, language has such cultural importance, and asking the world to all give up their language is just, you know, that's never going to happen. But this idea of a universal language and jet lag and being tired, and how it's something that everybody across all cultures experiences. And for me, introducing the idea of the Esperanto of blank right after we see these three major figures, the Master Moon, but then mainly Bill Gray and Mao. It's awesome because we're talking about Esperanto, we're talking about universality, and then we have these three figures. And so it's bringing all three of these ideas together. And that sentence just does so much heavy lifting with all, and also at the same time, it's just beautiful, you know. And I don't know, it's just things like that. Authors who are able to take like 4 or 5 words and synthesize such complex ideas, the whole essence of the novel synthesized in one clause. Absolutely outstanding. And so in this little meetup, we realize that Britta is there to meet Scott to discuss going to photograph Bill Gray. And Britta, she's dedicated her whole career to photographing writers of any type. Famous writers, reclusive writers, prize winners, everything, you know, terrible ones, unknown ones, well-known ones, everything in between. And Bill Gray, a lot like Salinger and these other writers, is a recluse, like Salinger, Pynchon, etc. And he hasn't been photographed in decades. But his 2 novels, and he's only written 2 novels, he wrote 2 early on in his career, hasn't written anything since, were wildly, wildly popular. And then he just kind of fell off. He never wrote anything again, and the world has kind of moved on, but the mystique and the prestige of him has risen. Because, you know, sometimes when everybody in the world desperately wants to hear from somebody and wants to talk to a writer and hear what they have to say, and the writer won't give it to them, it makes their voice, you know, bigger. It makes it more important. Imagine if Hemingway would have written, I don't know, The Sun Also Rises, and then took a 40-year break. Everybody would be saying, you know, what has he got next? What has he got next? What has he got next? Let's hear it. Let's hear it. Let's hear it. And so that's the case with Bill. And he's agreed to let Britta come to his reclusive cabin or his house, wherever he lives, and photograph him. But of course, he has some conditions, and she has to meet Scott alone. So Bill is nowhere to be seen. He's not in New York City. She meets Scott, and then Scott is going to be in charge of interviewing her a little bit and then taking her to meet Bill. And through this, we get little tidbits of the fear of people in crowds through Scott, and we can only assume that Bill is worse. Scott is apprehensive about the streets, and he talks about how Bill says that NYC, its only real function is to measure time, to measure like the progress of man, things like that. And then right at the end of this chapter, we get the first linkage between terrorists and writers. And in many ways, that is another core point of the book. I've talked earlier about how we're talking about like who are the purveyors of culture. Is it still writers? Is that role waning for writers? But the solution, or I guess the answer, and it's not a good one, that DeLillo is putting forward is, no, it's not Master Moon, it's not Mao that are taking over the role that writers used to hold of like the cultural purveyors, but rather terrorists. And that's a terrible idea to think, but he makes a very compelling argument as to why it's true. And so this is what Britta says after Scott outlined all the demands and how she's going to go meet Bill. So she says, "I feel as if I'm being taken to see some terrorist chief at his secret retreat in the mountains. Tell Bill. He'll love that," Scott said. So that's very small. It's very small. But as you continue to read, you start to see the referencing to terrorism and to terrorists really ramp up throughout the rest of the book. And so this is our first little tease of it. And it's positioning Bill as the terrorist chief. So he's the leader. He's the leader of the terrorist group. And so it's positioning, okay, so Bill is like a top writer. And so he's equal to the terrorist chief who's at the top. And maybe Scott is like an underling. And then, the terrorists will have their underlings as well. And so that's just kind of setting up this dichotomy that we're going to spend the rest of the novel analyzing and looking at critically. And so yeah, that's where they end us with chapter 1. That's a lot for the first chapter of a novel, definitely. But I think, you see, the novel is not very long. It's pretty short. Let me see. I think it's like 200 and something pages. Let's look. Yeah, it's 241 pages in this edition. So it's a pretty relatively short novel. But he does a lot with it. It's a critique of mass society. It's a critique of our increasingly online culture, our collectivism, our love of capitalism, and our universal succumbing to capitalism, especially in our major cities like New York, as well as this idea of course, terrorists becoming the purveyors of modern culture. Our world is being shaped by these massive events done by small groups, with the biggest, of course, being 9/11, the Paris attacks, all of this, that these are the things that are shaping the culture. The whole one group does something and the world changes overnight. And those big events, they influence how we see everything. The lens that I see the world in, because I grew up in a post 9/11 world, is wildly different than the way that my mom, or especially my grandparents, view the world. And I don't know, it's something that is terrible in many ways. I mean, there's no denying that, but it's true. I think it's universally true, at least in the context of our modern world and contemporary, especially Western society. And that's the mark of a great novel. A novel, in its best form, it tells you truth. It tells you the truth with a capital T, whether you like it or not, whether that truth is comforting, whether it's horrifying. They just tell you how it is, or at least how they see it, and DeLillo certainly does that. So that's all we have for chapter 1 of Mao II by Don DeLillo. My name is Nicholas Corcel, and I will see you shortly to be discussing and analyzing chapter 2.